Hello friends, welcome back to this second section on language. Now, in the first section on language, we saw what is language, we saw how it differentiates from communication, and we saw several parts of language, how it is made up of, what is a syntax, what is a phoneme, what is a morpheme, and then what is semantics, what is pragmatics. So, basically that comprises of what a language is, and then at the end of it grammar. So, basically what language is, what it is composed of, how these things, the rules of grammar really work into language, and so on and so forth. Now, in this section we will focus on to something called understanding comprehension of language and the production of language. So, first section was describing things about the nature of language, and the second section is about producing language and understanding comprehending language. So, basically let us start this session and try and understand how language is comprehended, how language is understood, or how language is produced. Now, language, like any other information which is being transferred from one person to another, is basically first taken in as a raw input, and it is transformed. So, the basic components of language are first perceived through a language processing unit in the brain, and then it is the raw materials or the raw parts of the language are then processed by this language processing unit to form meaningful representations, where these representations then mean something or have some semantic value. Now, the steps which are followed in taking in the raw language input and then processing it, so that a meaningful representation, a semantically meaningful representation is created. What are the steps into it? Let us look into those. So, the question is, how does speech perception happen? How do we perceive speech? Now, as opposed to perception of words, which we do one word at a time, one by one. So, how does word perception happen, or perception of letters and numbers happen? So, basically what we do is we do some kind of fixation, and we do some kind of jumps, and these fixation and jumps happen from the first word to the first letter of the word to the last letter of the word. Then there is a gap, and within that gap the meaning of the word is evaluated, and then we go to the next word. And similarly, in terms of speech perception, since perception of words happen this way, in visual materials happens in the way that I just described. So, it is basically believed that speech perception should also follow something like this, and the simplest way to look at how speech perception would happen is to be like text perception, that is, one sound at a time should be perceived, and the pauses between a spoken word, two spoken words should be used to identify the meaning of the words. This is how a general knowledge should be, because text perception basically takes place, as I said you, it takes place in terms of word by word perception. So, the first letter of the word and last letter of the word is basically looked into. This is called jumping or fixations, which the eye does, and based on that there is a gap, and if there is no gap, then perception of letters become difficult, but this gap between letters actually help the brain to interpret the meaning of the word, and so this goes on, and this is how the meaning is generated. So, in speech perception also it should be, we assume that it should be similar, that word by word is perceived, each word that somebody is speaking. Now, when I am speaking to you, the perception should work in this way, that you should be perceiving each word, and the gap in my speaking, the time gap between two words when I speak, that should be utilized for making meaning out of it. So, that is how we believe it is, but that is not how actually it really works. So, Milner 1990, he described two problems with such a theory, which says that word by word perception happens and meaning is generated from those kind of words. And what is these two problems? First, Milner, he found out that speech was continuous in nature. The nature of speech was continuous, and so how does it happen? For example, refer to the spectrogram. So, what I will show you, I will show you spectrogram. So, what is the spectrogram actually? This is an output of speech. So, once you produce speech, there is a air pressure. So, just in front of the mouth. So, once the words come out of your mouth, a certain air pressure is created, and this air pressure is measured through a instrument, and then it is displayed in through a spectrograph, through a CRT tube or a spectrograph, and that is how what is basically a spectrogram is. So, the amount of pressure which is generated when you speak certain words against when you speak nothing is presented on an xy coordinate in terms of voltages, in terms of sounds, and in terms of the sound in hertz and on the time axis. So, that is how a spectrogram really works. So, a spectrogram is basically these pressures that I emit when speaking a word, and the graph of it, which is in terms of sounds produced in terms of hertz and through a particular time period. So, I am just going to show you a spectrogram of the word that I am written down here. So, they are buying some bread. Let us look at this. And if we find obvious stops or obvious gaps in the spectrogram, it would mean that speech is not continuous, and so after each word there is a gap. So, let us look into it. So, spectrograms, this is the spectrogram as you can look at, and so when you look at the spectrogram, it is one continuous emission or one continuous graph which is out there. So, on this axis we have the time, and on this axis we have the measurement of sound in terms of hertz, right. So, air pressure basically in terms of hertz. And so, what is the result of this? The result of this is that spectrograms indicate that rarely there are pauses around each sound. So, once a sound is produced, there are no pauses between them, and rather different sounds from the same words blend into each other. So, what happens is when I say they are buying the bread, what really happens is the end of the and the beginning of are blended together, and so there is no gap, and that is what Milner pointed out. He said that speech is continuous. So, assuming that speech is like perception of text is not correct. One reason being that it is continuous. I just showed you that this sentence, they are buying some bread, in terms of a spectrogram how it will look like, and we see that the word endings, they sort of merge into each other, and so there are very few chances, or there are no chances for gaps between them, which negates the idea that people get time to between spoken language to make meaning out of it. Now, the second problem which Milner listed is the fact that a single phoneme, when if it is changed into a spoken text, the context changes. For example, if I remove if a to, a do and oto can be made, these words can be made by replacing the t, d and o phoneme. So, a single phoneme if taken out, or if it is replaced, or if it is misheard in certain way, what would happen is the word would itself change. And so, one single phoneme, one single speech sound, and phoneme is a very basic idea. So, one simple problem with hearing this phoneme would actually lead to the interpretation, or would actually lead to different interpretation altogether. And so, what I have here is that this same phoneme. So, you have this is for to, this is for do, and this is for auto. And as you can see here that this is the time axis in terms of time, as you see it is 200-400 millisecond, and this is the pressure, air pressure. So, in terms of sound pressure, in terms of hertz or cycle per second. And so, what you see is that the same kind of spectrograph you can see for both do, to and auto, but only the beginning changes. So, replacing a phoneme, for example, t replaced by a d or a o, the beginning of this changes, but more or less it is the same, right. And so, that is what it is. So, one for phoneme changes, the whole idea of the word or the whole meaning of the word changes. Now, these are the two facts why sound perception cannot be similar to speech perception. Now, another problem which is to be noted is that men and women, they speak in different frequencies, different accents, and across different contexts. They people speak in different ways. So, it is not about gender, it is not about how women and men speak together, it is also dependent on the kind of frequency. So, some people speak very softly, some people speak little bit loud, the kind of accents that people use. So, it could be a raw accent, it could be a toned up accent, or any reason, or different situations. For example, in a lecture you could be whispering, in some other, for when you are lecturing it could be a monotonous tone, and so on and so forth. So, across context, across different situations, people, both men and women, use different kind of speaking or speak differently, and so this could be another problem which could lead to the fact that speech perception is not like text perception. So, then if it is not like text perception, how is speech perceived then? What is the way in which speech perception happen? And the answer to this is that speech perception is generally categorical in nature, and that is what it is. The answer is that we come specially equipped with systems which perceives speech in an efficient way, in a very efficient way, and that is called categorical processing. So, what happens here is that certain categories are automatically made, and so when we speak, the speech is automatically without awareness pushed into these categories, and that is how we actually go ahead and process speech. We pay attention to certain acoustic properties of the speech and ignore certain others. So, based on the acoustic properties we can tell whether a person is male or female. Remember experiments from the attention section, where we saw that from the unshadowed ear people were able to tell things like the tone of voice and the gender of the person who is speaking, and so these things are automatically, attention is paid onto it automatically, and so people were able to tell from the non-shadowed ear also. So, basically in categorical processing, what really happens is there are certain categories, and these, within these categories, when a person is speaking, automatically we perceive or we force the spoken speech into these fixed categories, and this happens without awareness. We are not really aware of the fact that we are doing it. So, we are not perceiving it in a continuous manner, we are not perceiving it in a breaked out manner, but what we do is certain categories are there. So, what is a noun, what is a verb kind of categories, or different categories, or what could be the constraint category, and so we look into speech, or we hear speech, and we take parts of speech, and we then go ahead and then push it, these parts, into different categories out there, and that happens without of any kind of awareness, with the kind of explicitity into it. So, perception of speech is also affected by something called visual cues, and these are known as context effect. So, certain kind of visual cues in the environment, they also affect kind of perception of speech that we do. Now, an experiment was done to show that these different things, that context affects perception of speech, and so Warren, what he did was he presented a statement like this to people. Now, the statement was, the state governors met with their respective, it should actually be legislatures, right, and so that is what it is, but where the word the word S would, the phoneme S would come, he produced a coughing sound. So, the statement runs as, the state government met with their respective legislatures concerning in the convening in the capital city. So, this is what the basic sentence was, and so what he did was, in the word legislature, where this phoneme would be, a cough sound was produced, a light cough sound was produced, and it was amazingly, people were not able to identify the cough sound. Only 1 out of 20 people actually they reported hearing the cough sound. 19 people didn't actually report the cough sound, and they could hear the word legislature very nicely, and the phoneme S here, legislature. So, phoneme S, and this basically is what is called the phoneme restoration effect. So, in which 120, so that is what it is. So, this sentence was presented, and a 120 millisecond portion was replaced. This was 120 millisecond portion where a phoneme was there and a coughing sound was induced. So, 1 out of 20% listening to this actually found out that there was a missing phoneme, and most of the 19 people restored this phoneme, and that is called the phoneme restoration effect. And that demonstrates that the perception that we actually do is categorical in nature. So, we do not look through word to word, we actually force implicitly or without awareness, we force part of sentences into preformed categories, and that is how perception of speech really happens. So, the answer to this or the result of this experiment was that people were capable of using a great deal of information to predict what the correct sound of the missing segment was, and as I said that people were able to restore this phoneme. They did not notice this break which was there, and because they were doing categorical processing, they were not even aware of it, that this has been replaced by a cough sound. Now, Warren in 70, they demonstrated this by presenting people with one of the 4 sentences. So, they presented people with these 4 sentences. Now, each one was the same recording with the exception of the final word has been spliced off and each contained a missing segment as indicated in the asterisk on. So, basically what Warren did was to find out whether people are able to restore this phoneme or not, or perform this phoneme restoration, which basically means that are people capable of implicitly filling up gaps into spoken speech. To demonstrate that, what Warren did was he presented 4 different sentences to people with one phoneme being spliced off, and what he wanted to see was whether people restore these phonemes or not. So, there were 4 sentences present to people with a missing segment, and in each of this the missing segment is the key to making meaning of the sentence. So, what were the sentences? The first sentences was, it was found that eel was on the axle. The second was, it was found that star eel was on the shoe, and so this star which you see here is basically the missing phoneme here. And so, I am pretty sure by now you would have come to know the answer for all of these, and so this was what was replaced. So, in first case this eel was related to an axle, in the second case this eel was related to a shoe, in the third case it was related to an orange, and in the fourth case it was related to a table. Now, take a second and tell me what the eel should actually be, and I am pretty sure that you would have come up with an answer. So, in the first case, when an axle was presented, the context helped people to replenish back or to fit in the right phoneme, and so people perceived wheel there. But in the second case, where it was the shoe, people did not say wheel, but people perceived the EEL, the part where the phoneme was spliced off, as heel, not wheel. Now, wheel was for axle because the axle is the context, and so wheel was replaced. If shoe is the context, then what was replaced was heel. But in the third case, when orange was the context, when orange was what was being referred to, the missing portion became peel, whereas in the fourth case, when table was what was the context or what was the whole sentence was referring to, it was meal, correct, and that is what it is. And so, depending on the sentence, participants reported hearing wheel, heel, peel and meal. So, basically they restored these phonemes of WH, the H in heel, the P in peel and the M in meal. This kind of thing is there, which basically again proves the hypothesis that people perceive speech sound automatically and implicitly, and how they do it? They do it through something called categorical processing, right. And so, it's a speech perception is basically not like text perception. People do not wait over speech segments, and the gaps between speech segments are not utilized for making meaning, rather the perception happens in a categorical automatic manner. Now, with the perception of speech or speech itself, there are certain errors which are there when we produce speech also. So, certain errors can also arise when production of speech happens. So, so beside perceiving speech from others, we also produce speech and to for others to comprehend and process the speech we are. So, it is not only always listening, we sometimes also talk. So, we produce speech, and so this is called speech production. Now, speech production itself can lead to certain kind of errors which are called speech errors, interactions in which the speaker intends to say quite clearly, but the speaker makes some solutions, substitutions or reorders the stimulus in a certain way. So, speech errors then are certain substitutions or certain reordering of the statement which makes the sentence not legible, and so these happens because we do some kind of a reordering in sentence productions, or we do some kind of a substitution in sentence production, and those are called speech errors. For example, Mary keeps the food in her vest. Now, when we say vest, actually this is wrong. And so, what has happened, and so you would see these kind of things happening in smaller children's. And so, what has happened here, obviously you can see, is the desk, the D is replaced by the phoneme V, and so what has happened is Mary keeps food in her desk. So, instead of the desk, by production itself it becomes desk, and it happens to most of us. We do these kind of problems. Another is or another sentence which shows this kind of speech production error is this one, where we sometimes make this kind of errors also, where what we have done is it's exchange of words. Sometimes we replace phonemes, or sometimes we exchange words also. So, look at this sentence, we sit around the song and sing fire, and so it happens to most of us. You will realize that people who can speak English, they can have these kind of errors into it. And so, here what has happened is the song is replaced by fire. So, the actual sentence should be we sit around the fire and sing songs, and so out of some substitution in speech production, what has happened is fire goes to the end of the sentence, song comes to the middle of the sentence, and now sentence becomes we sit around the song and sing fires, which is syntactically correct, it is semantically correct, but makes no meaning in it. So, in terms of pragmatics, it makes no meanings. So, in terms of grammar rules, it is perfectly correct, but has no meaning, and so this is an error of speech production. And this error arises because we substitute certain words for certain other words. Similarly, Garrett 1988, while studying such speech errors, found that the word substitution has two broad categories of errors. So, this substitution of words, this exchange of words can then also be divided into two different classes, two huge classes out there. And what are these classes? One, a word substitution can a word substitution error can happen in terms of meaning relations. So, in terms of meaning relations, in the sense that I can substitute a word by another word which is equivalent to the meaning of the first word. So, here replacing finger with a toe or walk with a run is what meaning relations are there. So, finger and toe are more or less like similar in meaning. So, what finger does is what a toe would do, and walk and run are more or less same in meaning, similar in meaning, exactly not the same, but then similar in meaning. And so, people could actually do this kind of word substitution error, and these word substitution errors are meaning related errors, or people can go ahead and form relation errors. So, form relations errors are generally very few, and it is very few that you will see these kind of errors. And so, what you do here is, instead of a guest, you would say goat. So, the guest has come, the goat has come, right, or mushroom is replaced by mustache. So, let us go to the field and pick up fresh mustache instead of the mushroom. So, form relation errors can also exist, and so Garrett says that these are two kinds of speech errors or speech related errors that can exist, and so these speech related errors can also create or are also categorized into form relations and meaning relations. Okay, so this is up till now we have seen that in the production of speech also. So, not only that writing language or written language has some kind of errors, while producing speech also we create a number of errors. And so, what we saw up till now is how speech is produced, and this production of categorical speech, the production of speech itself which is categorical in nature, this can also lead to certain kind of errors which the producer of the speech is making, and which confuses the listener, and so he would be hearing something else, right. And so, the question now is, how do we comprehend a sentence, right. So, when somebody writes a sentence, how do we go ahead and read this sentence? So, how do people understand and recover their meaning from sentences? So, given the fact there are certain sentences written in front of you, how do you make meaning from such a sentence? The answer to this lies in the fact that people pay attention to syntactic constituents, however, they do not process sentence clause by clause. So, what people generally do is that they look at a sentence and they look at parts of the sentence or they look at the syntactic constituents of a sentence, right, but then they do not process a sentence clause by clause. So, what really they do, they actually look at a sentence, look at the constituent of a sentence and make a gist out of it, and that is how they process a sentence. They actually do not read the sentence clause by clause, and that is the way in which people go ahead and process sentences. So, after reading a sentence, what people do is they discard most of the words in the sentence and just keep the meaning, the central representation or the central meaning in terms of a gist representation. So, comprehending a sentence involves resolving its possible ambiguities. So, in sentence comprehension also certain kind of errors can occur, and so it has been found that people are very good in resolving ambiguities. If a sentence and we saw that in the first section also, that even if the sentence has a certain problem, people were able to resolve the ambiguity. For example, the first sentence that we looked at, the very yellow dog chased something something, we saw that people are able to, people although do not know the descriptive rules of grammar of how to correct this sentence, but they know the prescriptive rules and they know how to correct this. So, in terms of sentence comprehension also, people are very good in resolving these ambiguities. Now, in the interesting thing here is that we normally do not notice ambiguities and only rarely we come to notice them. When do we note ambiguities? Only when certain kind of sentences arise or certain kind of certain parts of the sentence have some confusions into us. Now, look at this sentence. The sentence says, the horse raced past, the barn fell. Now, if you look into the sentence, what happens is initially the sentence is all right, the horse raced past the barn, till the point that you come to fell, and fell is ambiguous, and these kind of sentences are called garden path sentence. So, it leads you to a certain direction of meaning, but then the last word creates a problem. And so, what is the problem? So, how do we go ahead and solve this? What is this is obviously an ambiguity. So, how do you solve this? One way to solve it is the horse raced past and put a comma here, the barn fell. Two parts of the sentence, two sentences to look at, now makes meaning. Or the horse raced past, the barn fell can be broken down into this two constants. And so, till the point of time that you are reading the horse raced past the barn, it is okay, but fell, the word fell itself is a problem, and so here is the problem. So, you can solve it by this way, and this type of sentences actually lead to ambiguities. Or look at this shirt. Now, this sentence says, the cotton shirts are made from, comes from Arizona. Now, from the beginning of the sentence, if you read, there is a pertinent meaning that you see to it, but at a point, at certain point, certain word arises which creates confusion. For example, the cotton shirts are made from, comes from Arizona. Now, there is a problem here. The cotton shirts are made from expects certain input as some form of it, all right. What form of cotton I am describing, the kind of cotton, qualifying the cotton example. So, simplifying the sentence, or basically if you want to make meaning of this sentence, and so here is where, so even from the start, the cotton shirts are made from, comes from Arizona is where the problem really comes in. And so, if you want to solve this sentence, the ambiguity is this part of the sentence. So, if you want to solve the ambiguity, what we really do is cotton shirts, if we put a comma here, the cotton shirts are made from, comes from Arizona, then the sentence loses its ambiguity and becomes a more meaningful sentence. But reading from onwards into this way creates an ambiguity, and so this kind of sentences creates ambiguity. But with normal ambiguity, because what happens is the people have already started reading the sentence, and so it has made people started thinking in a particular direction. But then from the from onwards or from the barn onwards, the next word which appears creates confusions, and so this kind of sentences make people assume confusions or make people think about confusions, and they need to then solve the ambiguity. So, these sentences are then called garden path sentences. The reason being that it starts making you think in a certain way, and then at some point of the sentence it pushes you into a different way, right. So, results from several studies, they suggest that when we process ambiguous sentences, all the meaning of the sentences are temporarily available. So, when we are looking at these kind of ambiguous sentences, and ambiguous sentences which has multiple meaning, the results from several experiments suggest that all meanings of the sentences are available. For example, if there is a sentence saying that this room is full of bugs, now both the meaning of the bugs the bugs as in terms of cockroaches or pets, or bugs in terms of listening devices are available to us. Depending on the context, we then decide after 3 phoneme length which word meaning will be accurate. And so, results from several studies basically suggest that. So, basically what it suggests is that when we are reading an ambiguous sentence, all the meaning of the ambiguous word, the word which is creating ambiguity, are temporarily available through an automatic bottom up process. So, while reading a sentence, every meaning, remember the sentence where we use bank in 2 different ways in terms of financial institutions and in terms of riverfront. Now, both the meaning are available. If a sentence, if this bank is creating confusion in a sentence, both the meanings would be available at the time of processing the sentence. Now, context effects do not immediately restrict the listener to most appropriate reading of the word. So, basically when we are reading a sentence, the way a sentence is created, the context in which a sentence is created, it does not stop the reader from interpreting all the meanings of the ambiguous word, right. Instead, for a short period, all meanings are accessible to them. Now, 3 syllables after the presentation of the ambiguous word, only one meaning remains active. So, what happens is the context does not decide what is the meaning of ambiguous word, of the ambiguous word which is created, the word which is creating ambiguity in ambiguous sentences. What really happens is 3 syllables after the processing of the ambiguous word, all meanings are available. Only after these 3 syllables has elapsed, the exact meaning or the meaning which befits the context then remains, and all other meanings are discarded. And so, researches has been done on several kind of sentences, and so since this we are not dealing in detail in language. So, I am not bringing in those examples which will show you how these experiments were done and how it was basically found out, but this is the result of it. So, 3 syllables after the presentation of the ambiguous word, only one meaning remains active, which is the meaning which is most appropriate to those contexts, suggesting that people resolve sentence ambiguity fairly quickly. So, no matter how ambiguous a sentence is, people are able to resolve these ambiguities. And how do they do this resolving of ambiguity? The fact is, they read the sentence to the point they come to the fact that the word which is creating ambiguity, and when they are reading the word which is creating ambiguity, context is the word, the context of the sentence does not help them. Till 3 phonemes or 3 syllables after the presentation of the word, all meanings are accessible, but only after 3 syllable presentations, which is a very brief time. Only after that the appropriate meaning or the necessary meaning or the most optimal meaning which befits that sentence remains, and all other meaning goes away. And certain experiments were done to create that. And so, what does it actually tell you? It tells you that people are able to read up ambiguous sentences very fast and resolve ambiguity very fast, right. So, although all meanings are available, but then people are very good in resolving ambiguities. Although they may not know the grammar, they may not know what is wrong with a sentence, but they can correct the sentence. So, they have this feeling, they have this implicit feeling, that is what we saw in the first lecture. They say they have this implicit idea of what is wrong, but they may not know the grammar of where it is wrong. Okay. So, up till now we have looked at speech perception and sentence comprehension. Very good. Let us now look at what is the comprehension of a text passage, or how text passages are comprehended. Now, for understanding how people process text passages, first we need to know how people actually read. So, what is the way in which people read? And Justin Carpenter 1987 used something called an eye tracker to monitor the eye fixations for written text. So, what they did was they used something called an eye tracker. So, eye tracker actually tracks the movement of the eyeball as it moves across written words, and so from that they had some idea of how people actually read. Now, results indicate that reading consists of a series of fixations and jump across text, with average fixation and jump being 250 and 10 to 20 in 10 to the power minus 3 second. So, basically 250 to 10 to 20 millisecond kind of a time frame. So, basically then what they found out from the study is that people just do not read text the way it is. What happens is the eyeball tracking experiment suggests that people jump from word to word and they then have fixations. So, when they are looking at a word, they look at the first word, they fixate it, they look at the last letter of the word, they stop there for some time, make meaning out of it, jump to the next next letter or next word, the first letter of the next word, last letter of the next word, look at the context, find meaning, next makes the jumps and make another jump into it. And so, this kind of jumping and fixations are how text is perceived. Now, Justin Carpenter's model assumes that as soon as readers encounter a new word, they try to interpret it and assign it a role. And this is called the immediacy assumption. So, in text passaging, what Justin Carpenter says is that when we are reading something and this fixation happens between the first letter and the last letter of the word, and then we wait there for a certain time, that is called the fixation time, and then we jump to the next word which is there. Now, during this period when we make this jump, this fixation and jump, during that period we immediately encounter, when we encounter that word, we immediately gather the meaning of the word, and that is called the immediacy assumption. So, as soon as we get a new word, we try to interpret what the word is. The author also formulated something called the I mind hypothesis, and so what is it? Which holds that interpretation of each word occurs during the time it is fixated. So, basically what happens is, when reading a text, there are certain jumps that the eye actually does, and so if we are reading at words like WRDS and like, these are the two things that we are looking, the eye will first fixate here, stay here, then look at the last word DS, then there is a context to it, since it is the language context and so words are related to context. So, we are teaching this, I am teaching this in a lecture on language, and so the context is there, and so this W word starting with W ending with S or ending with D would be a word, that is how the immediacy assumption is, and so immediately that is what it is. And the I mind hypothesis says that as the fixation happens and before the jump, this word is interpreted, this word is matched with a segment or matched with a representation into the brain, and a meaning is extracted out of it. And so, these are what it is. So, immediacy says that interpretation is done as soon as the fixation happens and a role is assigned to it, and the I mind hypothesis says that meaning is also extracted at the same point of time. So, it is not only the role assigning to new word, what is the role of that new word, whether it is a verb, whether it is a noun, whether it is a pronoun, what form it is doing in a sentence, or what is the role that is playing in a sentence, that is called the immediacy assumption. The I mind hypothesis says that the meaning is also extracted that very time, with the fixation time. So, fixation tells you what each word means, what is the role it has in the sentence, and what how to interpret this role. And the I mind hypothesis says that also the meaning of the word is extracted at that point in time, and that is how we read. So, through these fixations and jumps across words to words is how we actually read, and that is how comprehension of text passages happen. Now, Justin Carpenter, they argued that a number of variables influences fixation duration. So, the amount of time that the eye fixates onto a particular word is influenced by a number of variables. And so, what are these variables? For example, word length. The bigger the word length, the more the fixation has to be, right. Also, word frequency, how frequently you see this word. So, words like apricot, words like aloe vera, words which people do not encounter in everyday life, they require longer fixations than words like cat, dog, hen, food, that kind of words which are more common. The word frequency, the usage of these words are more common, and syntactically and semantically ambiguous words. So, if words are syntactically and semantically ambiguous, for example, bank, two meanings of bank, or bugs, two meanings of the word bugs, or multiple meaning of the word bug, or the position of the word is such that it can also be an adjective and it can also be a noun, that can happen. So, the word could qualify, it could mean too many things into it. In those cases, the fixations are long, or the fixations are of larger duration, and the jumps are then not quicker, it takes more time to jump and then more longer fixation, because that determines how much time you have to spend into it. Why? Because then you have to first, if we have words which are ambiguous, we have to first assign a role to it, because that role will tell you what this word means and what this word how this word is driving the sentence, right. And so, basically that. So, longer the word, more complex the word, lesser the frequency, more the fixation period. Kintish and Kinan 73, they found out the semantic factors influence the reading task. There are certain semantic factors which also go ahead and influence text comprehension or reading task. They showed that two sentences of equal length might be differentially difficult to process. And so, they said that the semantic, the meaning, how much meaning a sentence carries, how much ideas that a sentence carries, that will also decide how easily a sentence can be read. So, those sentences which has a number of ideas onto them, they will be difficult to understand, they will take more time to comprehend, or comprehension of sentences which have multiple ideas embedded into them will take more time than sentences which have simple ideas. And so, they presented something like this. So, the word is Romulus. The legendary founder of Rome, took the woman of the Sabine by force. And so, there are 2 or 3 ideas into it, and so you look into Romulus, woman, and by force are 3 ideas, and then you have Sabine is a woman, these are 2 other things, and so the number of ideas are limited here, 3 ideas, and so it takes some time to process. In comparison to that, if you look into it, it is the same length. The second sentence is also the same length, but here the number of ideas are more, and so it takes more time to process. And what is this sentence? Cleopatra's downfall lay in her foolish trust in the fickle political figure of the Roman world. And so, if you look into it, there are multiple ideas into it or multiple segments into it. Now, because of what? Because of trust of Cleopatra, Cleopatra fell down, and within that, within the trust, what kind of trust? There is a foolish trust, there is a fickle trust, and there is the part of the world. So, that is related to the Cleopatra and figure in one idea, and Cleopatra falling down is the other idea. So, trusting of Cleopatra is one idea, and the falling down of Cleopatra is another idea, and within that there are certain systems which are there, and if you look into it, it has multiple ideas, right. And so, if it has multiple ideas, it will take more time to process, and so the more meaning, more ideas that have, the more meaning is to be interpreted, the more meaning of sentence has, the more time it will take to be interpreted, and the more fixations are required into it, and the longer duration of comprehension for such words would occur. Now, another factor which influences the processing of text has to do with relationship among sentences. What sentences or how sentences are related to each other. So, the more the sentences are related to each other, the larger the relationship, or if the 2 sentences are not related to each other, then it will take more time to be processed. Now, Halevand and Clark 1974 describe something called the given new strategy. And what is this given new strategy? They say that whereby listeners and readers divide sentences into 2 parts, the given part and the new part. So, when they are listening into a sentence, when people who listen to a sentence, they are listening into a sentence, they immediately divide the sentence into 2 parts. One is the given part, the other is the new part. Now, the given part of a sentence contains information that is familiar from the context of the preceding information or the background information. So, when you are listening to a sentence, what you tend to do is break the sentence into its 2 parts. First part is the given part. The given part has all the informations, or given part has all the inputs from preceding context or from where the borrow over effect from previous sentences, and people are familiar with it. The new part contains unfamiliar information. New part of the sentence, they contain unfamiliar information. So, listeners first search memory for information corresponding to the given information and update memory by incorporating the new information offered as an elaboration of the given part. So, basically then let us look at a sentence and then see how does this thing really work. So, basically what I am doing is I am creating 2 sentences and with a given part and a new part. So, if I write this sentence, we got some beer out of the car. This is the first part, and the second part is the beer was warm. So, sentence number 1, sentence number 2, right. This is the given part and this is the new part. Similarly, we checked the picnic supplies, and then again the same, this is the given part and the beer was warm. Now, in which case do you think people will take more time to comprehend? Yes, you are right. In the first case, people will take lesser time to comprehend this sentence. The reason being that in the given sentence, in the given part of the sentence, the mention of beer is there, and so it makes a relation with this sentence, and so your comprehension is easy. So, basically they got some beer out of the car, and so they were warm, and it is easy to interpret. But in this case, the mention of beer is not there in the first sentence, and so you do not know how the new part connects to the old part, and so then first you have to make the assumption that beer is part of the picnic supplies. First you have to make this supposition, assumption, only then you can comprehend this sentence. And in this case, it is easy because previous context provide you that idea, and so if this is a given new sentence, people will take lesser time to verify this one than this one, because the first part of the sentence contains the referral to the new part. Right. So, this is basically what they say. So, in a given new strategy, the more different the given and new parts are, the more difficult comprehension turns out to be. Now, Van der Broek and Gustafsson in 1990, they offered 3 conclusions from research on reading text. First, the mental representation is a construction by the reader which differs from and goes beyond the information of the text itself. When you read something, and that is why I always advise my students to read books. What happens is, when you read something, you make a new world out of it, a new construction. You go beyond the book and imagine things which is not written even in the text, and so people own this mental imagery. And so in the last chapter on mental imagery, we saw that people have this mental imagery, make these mental representations in visual form. So once you read a text, people make certain imageries or certain text or certain kind of formats which are personal to them, and so they go beyond the what is written in the word, and that becomes personal to us. And so these personal things, these personal influences, representations that we make of text help us in understanding something. So when people read something, they create a mental representation which is personal to them, and it is beyond what is written onto the text. The second is, the representation is coherent. When we read text, the representations have to be coherent in the sense that it is linked in ways, right. So one part of the sentence text should always be related to the second part, and that is coherency is there. So even if we read like if we are reading a novel, we read the back part first and the front part in the middle of the novel, we still make this coherency, the fill up gaps is there, and this coherency is always maintained. And the third is readers' attentional resources are limited. We cannot be very ambiguous in writing sentences. If we write very ambiguous sentences, since the attention span of the resources is limited, text comprehension will be flawed. So when writing a text, for comprehending, we should be assured of the fact that first, whatever we are writing, people are there, people will misinterpret it, or people will create their own constructions out of it. So it should be very limited. It should be written in a way that it should give the chance for lesser representation, varied representation. Also, the representations that we form, the writing that we do should be coherent. It should not be all over the place, having all kind of meanings into it. And third, that it should be written very strictly in ways that respect people's attentional resources, which basically means that the idea should be clearly spread out. If it is not, then people's attentional resources are very limited, and so will keep on jumping from one's meaning to others. Right then, so this is how text comprehension happens. Now let us look at an interesting fact, which is stories. How do people comprehend stories? We have looked at how people comprehend text. Now let us look at how people comprehend stories. So what is the way in which people actually read stories? And so for reading story, it has been found that there is something called story grammars. So story grammars are described as the way in which people comprehend large integrated pieces of text using script, schemas and grammar of the language. So while reading a story, while reading a novel, while reading some kind of art work of fiction or non-fiction, when reading any kind of large text which they need to comprehend, they use certain kind of grammars which is different from the kind of grammar that we saw in the first part of this lecture. What is it then? So what are story grammars? These are similar to scripts in that both have variables or slots that are filled in differentially by different stories. So, basically story grammar is kind of a script, right, it is kind of a block, and so what this block does is this block says that each story should have certain fixed factors into it, right. So, what story grammar suggests is that people expect certain kind of fixed factors. So, for example, when we are looking at a story, each story should have a protagonist, the person who is the one who is acting the main component of the story or the main person of the story. Then it should have a setting where the story is setting from, where it is coming from, where it is based on, a plot or what really happens in the story, what is the baseline of the story, background of the story, conflicts and resolutions. Then if we are writing a story, there has to be some kind of a conflict, and then the storyteller resolves this conflict, and all these are expectations that people have, and these are called story grammars. So, every story should have things like this, these type of grammars onto it. Now, story grammars are similar to syntactic grammars in that they help us identify the units of each role plays in the story. So, basically, like what grammar does for us, what syntax does for us, because syntax tell you in a sentence what is the subject, what is the object and what is the verb, and what role each object is playing in a sentence, and that helps you into making a legal sentence. Similarly, story grammars actually tell you the main constituents of the story, what is the protagonist, who is the protagonist, what is the plot, what is the setting, what is the tone, what are the conflicts which are there, what are the resolutions, so that you come to know in one brief look into it what the story is about or what the story is going to tell you, right. And so, these are fixed factors. It is story grammars are like syntactic rules for grammar. Now, story grammars, they provide a framework with which to expect certain elements and sequences and to fill with default values, things are not explicitly stated. So, basically story grammar then tells you that any story has to have these things. Now, if it is not, if something is not explicitly mentioned here, we fill it implicitly to make a story. Let us look into what story grammars is. So, this is basically a story of the three little pigs. Now, obviously, when I say a story of the three little pigs, there are certain expectations that people have. What will the story have, right? And so, first of all, there should be character, the protagonist, and the protagonist is, there has to be, first of all, if it is a story about three little pigs, so three little pigs have to be there. That is the main thing. And then if the three little pigs are there, just three little pigs going around is not going to solve a problem. So, conflict has to be made, and for a conflict, and a villain has to be, an anti-hero has to be put in, and that is what the wolf is. So, story grammars then give you this idea that only the hero is not going to make up a story. So, some kind of a villain has to be brought in, anti-hero is to be brought in, because the anti-hero and hero, when they collide, will produce the kind of problems or the kind of difficulties, contradictions, which has to be resolved later on, because most stories work around this way. And so, I have now created a wolf. Now, obviously, if there is a villain and there is a hero, then there is some kind of problem has to arise, because they cannot, heroes and villains cannot live together. And so, what is the problem here? The wolf wants to eat the three little pigs. Now, we have a story in condition. So, we have a problem, we have certain characters into it, we have all the characters into it, and we have a title of it. So, let us then write the story, certain events into it, and so we can fill it. So, what I have done is we have put in some, so wind blows the house, wolf blows down the straw house, then wolf blow down the stick house, wolf can't blow down the brick house, wolf climbs the chimney. And so, these are the three kind of houses these pigs have, they live in, and so once the wolf goes ahead and blows it, the pigs create a new kind of a house. Why they create a new kind of house? Because they are afraid of this particular wolf, and they don't want to be eaten. And so, this is the this is the a set of events. You can create any kind of event, just look into it. And then the resolution is, wolf falls into a pot of boiling water, runs out or the open door, and is never seen again. So, the resolution is that the wolf is going to eat the pigs. So, the resolution is, these pigs were actually boiling water, and the wolf comes down a chimney, falls onto the water, burns himself, and says that no, I am not going to do this again, learns his lesson and goes away and never returns back again. So, this is how a story is created, this is how situations is created, certain contradictions are created, and so on and so forth. On this side, you will see
the story structure and recall. And so, I leave it to you to actually read. So, basically there are different kind of things in a story, for example, what it is, what is the event, structure of the event, episode, beginning, development, simple reaction, and so on and so forth. So, basically then most stories have these kind of fill in gaps, and so this is how a story grammar really works. And so, what is the need for a story grammar? Because it gives us certain kind of insight of how a story is going to work, and then if something is missing, we can always go ahead and fill that particular thing. Now, looking at something called Gricean's maxim of conversation. Up till now, we have looked at something called speech, how it is perceived, what is grammar, what is sentence perception, all those things. But there are certain maxims of conversation, there are certain rules of conversation which needs to be followed, and so Gricean gives these maxims. So, Grice 1975 believed that for people to converse, each must do more than just produce utterances, that is phonological sound. They must syntactically and semantically produce sound which are appropriate. For example, if you look into two sentences, I just heard that Joe got promoted today, isn't that great? If A is saying and B says, so Salt Lake City is located in Utah, and the third is Charles Darwin is the father of modern evolution, they are not conversing at all. There is no conversation, although all the sentences here are semantically correct, syntactically correct, have meaning, but they are not following the conversation. So, there are certain rules of conversation. So, what is it? What is the, and again the A comes up with the answer, then what is the square root of 34? B says that chocolate ice cream is sweet. So, basically this is not how a conversation is actually progressing. And so, Grice described the speaker in a conversation should actually produce some kind of a maxim, so follow some kind of a rules into it. The four maxims are there. First is the quantity. Whenever we speak, we should speak in terms of quantity. We should not speak more, we should not speak less, but we should speak enough. For example, somebody asks you the time and you say 4 o'clock, this is not quantity, because 4 o'clock could be morning, 4 o'clock could be evening. So, you should give him enough information, not too much information, but enough information. Then quality, quality in the sense that whatever you are saying should have some kind of a context, some kind of a quality into it. If there is no quality that you have into your speech, if you have no context into your speech or no meaning into your speech, then it will not be processed in the right way. Then you have maximum of relation. If you are speaking a sentence and two parts of the sentence make no relation. So, I am going to the market and the sun is shining on my head, and the two sentences have no relation with each other. So, when you are saying two sentences or when you are saying a sentence, both the parts of the sentence should have some relation, and so this maximum of relation should be always followed. It should not be avoided, it should not be bounced. So, people should have or speak sentences which have relationships or which express relationships into each other. And 4 is the maximum of manner. You should always have good manners. If you are speaking in the wrong manner, so if you are speaking to somebody who is elder than you and you say come here, sit down, that is not a manners which is to be done. Similarly, speaking to people who are smaller than you. So, certain maxims are to be followed. If it is somebody who is senior to you, who is for old age, please use words like please or some kind of respect has to be given, and these are the maxims which is there. Similarly, if you are referring to people who are below of your age or of similar age, it is okay, but of below age, then you will have to use some kind of a mannerism into it. If you do not, then you are not known to be a nice social person. And so, if violation of rule A and B is there, then people are called uncooperative and obnoxious. So, just telling you something like giving parts and bits of information or no quality information, no meaning information at all, then people are known to be uncooperative and obnoxious, and people violating rule C are known to be bizarre, because if you do not say relations, if you just keep on saying things, then they are bizarre in nature. Okay, then. So, what influences this language have on other cognitive process? Up till now we have seen what is a language and how it is related to different cognitive processes. So, what is the influence that these language or the language has on different cognitive processes? So, there are two ways to look into it. First, language and other cognitive processes operate independently, one view says that, and the second is language and other cognitive processes are dependent on each other, and both of this view, one view says that they are separate. Language has nothing to do with other cognitive process, and the other view says that they are integrated together, and both of these are further explained by two popular hypotheses of language in language cognition. One of these hypotheses is called the modularity hypothesis. And so, what does this hypothesis actually say? So, it was proposed by John Feder, philosopher Jerry Fodor in 1982-85. and argued that some cognitive processes, in particular perception and language, they are modular. So, they process or they do processing in a modular formula. Modularity of a process. So, what is modularity then? Modularity of a process says that it is domain specific, operates specifically with certain kind of inputs. So, language then is modular because it operates only through certain kind of inputs. If you give the wrong input, language is not going to work. Similarly, with perception, if you give the wrong input, perception is not going to be taking place, and so for perception to take place, a certain kind of input has to be given. And the second is informationally encapsulated, which basically means that operates independent of the believer and other people's information available to the processor. No matter what people believe, language is independent. The processing of language is independent. What we say is obviously dependent on the context or what we believe, but the processing of language, if somebody says something to you, how it is processed, that is informationally encapsulated, which means that language processors don't depend on people's belief system or their expectations to process things. And so, this is how language is independent, or language is not dependent on other cognitive process. So, basically then modularity hypothesis or Fodor's view is that language is modular in nature, and that is why it is not related to any other, because it has specific inputs defined, and for only specific inputs is going to work, and also the fact that it processing is not dependent on people's belief systems, their expectations, their views, and so on and so forth. In direct opposition to this, there is the Whorfian hypothesis. Whorfian by example, or Benjamin Whorf was actually a chemical engineer, and so he gave the idea that language has to be related with other different kind of cognitive processes which is out there. And so, what did he say? He said that language and other cognitive process are strongly related. He believes that language development has a lot to do with the kind of atmosphere or the kind of environment where somebody is born with, and so the environment in which you are born shapes your language, right. Somebody coming from a very rich environment will have a different kind of language in comparison to people who are coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, people who are coming from those backgrounds where the language is not enriched, and so their thinking, their language, their whole idea would change because the environment forces it. And so, he believes that language, as one grows up learning and speaking, organizes and directs the way one perceives the world, organizes information about the world around it. That happens because the world around you gives you a different nature of the world interaction with you, or your interaction with the world gives you a different kind of feeling, a different kind of thought process, and this thought process will then change the way language is there. And so, when you see somebody from the street, the way he speaks, the way his thought process is, and somebody from very elite background, when you look at his speech and the way he speaks, both are different. And so, this is the interpretation of the differences which is there. So, basically then in this section on language, what we did was we continued from the earlier section where we looked at what is language and what are the parts of the language, and we proceeded by explaining how language comprehension is done, or basically how speech is produced. So, we looked at what is speech production and how it is produced, and what are the errors that can arise in production of speech. We also looked at comprehension of text messages and comprehension of sentences and grammars. We then looked at some principles of better communication, of how people should be speaking, and then finally, we looked at a very popular debate, the modularity versus the non-modularity, or the debate between the fact that language is like other cognitive process and so it is interacting with them, against the debate that language is different from other cognitive process and should not be interacting. So, this is the basic overview that we did in language. We studied what is language, how it is produced, what are the rules for it, and so on and so forth. Later, we saw how it is the production of language, the errors that happens with the production of language, the comprehension, how comprehension of spoken and written language happens, and then the errors that can arise there, and then we looked at how stories are perceived, and to end with we looked at a famous modular versus Whorfian debate into language comprehension and language cognition. Thank you.